Loner rancher gave his only blanket to a native girl on a bitter night. The next day, gold broke the frost beneath his cabin. But long before that mercy bore fruit, it was just another silent winter, and a man named Elias Mercer hammering his loneliness into timber and stone. The final blow of Elias Mercer's hammer echoed against the granite face of the distant hills. He let the tool fall to the frozen ground and stepped back to survey the work. 4 solid walls, a narrow chimney already breathing smoke into the gray sky, and a sloped roof thick with shingles he'd carved by hand. After 2 months of cutting, hauling, shaping, and not a single spoken word to another soul, the cabin stood. It was not elegant, but it would hold. He wiped the back of his wrist across his brow. The air bit harder now. That first snow was coming, the kind that stung the skin and silenced the woods. He could feel it in his joints, the same way he used to feel a bullet coming in the war. There were signs if you'd lived long enough to read them. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace licked at the stone walls. He had lined every seam with moss and pitch, not because it was pretty, but because he knew that out here, bad carpentry wasn't just ugly, it was fatal. Elias was 37, though most days he felt twice that. His hands carried the scars of both medicine and construction. Years spent stitching men back together in army tents, followed by years building homes that other men would live in. But there'd been nothing left to build after Kansas City, nothing worth saving after the sickness took Anna. The partnership that collapsed afterward only confirmed what he'd already learned. Men often fail each other more than the storms do. He had chosen this patch of wilderness not for the view, but for its silence. 15 miles from the nearest outpost, a day's hard ride to town through broken ridgelines and unstable trails. That was the point. He'd had enough of people, enough noise. The government called it opportunity, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. To Elias, it was something simpler, a place to disappear. The fire crackled as he ladled beans into a dented tin bowl. Salt pork, hard biscuit. He'd eaten the same for 12 days now, and likely would for 12 more. If he rationed carefully, he wouldn't need to ride out again until spring. That was the plan. But even the best-laid plans meant little to the mountain. The wind outside rose in pitch. Not yet a storm, but it was coming. It moved through the timber like a warning, bending pines at their spine. He set his bowl aside and listened, not to the wind, but to the pattern beneath it. Something steady, not branch, not beast. Knock, knock, knock. 3 of them, measured, deliberate, and unmistakably human. He reached for the Winchester mounted above the fireplace. Visitors in this country didn't come unannounced, and they rarely came for good. Heart thudding, Elias crept to the door, stepped to one side, and slowly drew back the latch. He opened it a crack, and the wind burst in like a scream. She stood there, shivering beneath a thin layer of soaked buckskin. Her hair whipped across her face, tangled with ice. She looked no older than 19. Blue lips, bare hands, and yet she didn't speak, didn't reach. She only stared, not with fear, but with something closer to acceptance, as though she had already died and was merely waiting for him to agree. Elias could hear the warnings, not the wind this time, but memories. Old men back in Missouri with stories about what happened to settlers who opened their doors to strangers from the tribes. Some said kindness got you killed. But the girl before him looked less like danger and more like every soul he had failed to save. He lowered the rifle. "Come in," he said. She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she stepped inside, and the storm slammed shut behind her. He turned the latch, and for the first time in months, Elias Mercer wasn't alone. The fire hadn't faded, but Elias added another log anyway, more to calm his nerves than to feed the heat. He glanced sideways at the girl, who stood motionless, dripping onto the floorboards. Her breath came in short, visible bursts, but her spine stayed straight, her gaze alert. She didn't clutch her arms or shift from foot to foot like someone simply chilled. She had grown used to cold, too used to it. "You should sit," Elias said, nodding to the stool near the fire. She didn't move. He turned away and opened the cedar trunk in the corner. From within, he pulled out a wool blanket, dark blue, thick, edged in a faded, embroidered pattern. His late wife Anna had stitched it herself one winter long past. It was one of the few things he'd carried with him across state lines, across heartbreak. Elias hesitated only a moment before stepping slowly toward the girl, arms extended. "Take it," he said gently. Her eyes studied his, not with fear, but with care, like she was measuring his soul. Then, with both hands, she reached forward and took the blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders and stepped toward the fire. Steam rose from her soaked sleeves. Her cheeks, once blue, began to bloom red. Elias busied himself at the stove, spooning the last of the beans into a second bowl. He split the salt pork evenly, made sure the biscuit wasn't too stale. He didn't speak as he set the meal before her. Words weren't needed just yet. She ate slowly, with intention. Every bite seemed weighed, grateful but restrained, as if she didn't quite believe it was hers to accept. When the food was gone, she placed the bowl down with great care. And then, finally, she spoke. "Thank you." Her English was clear, marked only by the careful inflection of someone who had learned the language later, not born to it. Elias nodded. "What's your name?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes traced the flicker of firelight on the stone hearth. "Nokoma," she said at last. "It means walks alone." He nearly smiled. Fitting. She looked up. "You live here alone?" He nodded. "Elias Mercer, I came for the quiet." "And did you find it?" "Too much of it, sometimes." A gust of wind rattled the shutters. The storm had picked up full strength now. Snow slammed sideways against the windows, and the wind howled like it carried the voice of the mountain itself. "You're lucky you made it," Elias said. "I wasn't meant to," Nokoma replied simply. "But here I am." Silence returned between them, not uncomfortable, just unfinished. He stood. "You should sleep. The storm might break by morning. I'll set a bed for you there." He gestured to the cot across the room. She looked at him again, the same long, measuring look from earlier, then walked slowly to the cot, still wrapped in the blue wool. Elias laid out a blanket for himself near the door. The rifle leaned within arm's reach. But he didn't feel danger, not from her. As he lay down, staring at the flickering shadows on the log walls, he thought of a passage Anna used to quote. She believed in angels, in mercy that moved through strangers. He'd rolled his eyes then. He didn't now. "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Hebrews 13:2. That night, Elias Mercer fell asleep to the sound of a stranger breathing steadily across the room. And for the first time in years, the storm outside was not the only thing he could hear. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. Elias stirred the embers with a poker and added a second log to the fire. The flames flared up, casting gold across the log walls. He hadn't spoken since offering her his name. Nokoma hadn't spoken either. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was alive, like a third person sitting in the room, waiting. She sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, still wrapped in Anna's blanket. The steam had stopped rising from her clothes, though a few strands of hair still clung wet to her cheek. Her eyes, wide and dark, never stopped moving. They flicked from the iron stove to the axe near the door, then to the latch he had drawn shut behind her. She was measuring the space, the exits, him. Elias understood. He'd been a medic in the war. He'd seen too many people with that same look, the kind that learned too early not to trust warmth when it arrived. He moved slowly, deliberately, as he ladled a second helping of beans into the tin bowl. This time he added an extra strip of salt pork. No words, just the soft clink of metal and the crackle of wood. When he set the bowl in front of her, she looked up at him. For a moment, her eyes seemed softer. Then, just as quickly, the walls came back up, and she nodded once before accepting the food. She ate without noise or haste, her fingers deft but careful. Elias returned to his chair and let the firelight do the talking. His bones ached from 2 months of hammering and hauling. His shoulders slumped forward, the posture of a man whose burden was no longer physical. Above the mantel, a small leather pouch hung from a wooden peg, Anna's. Inside were 2 things: a letter she'd written before the fever took her, and the simple wooden cross she used to clutch at night. He hadn't opened the pouch in over a year. He didn't open it now, but he looked at it long and hard. "You built all this?" Nakoma's voice startled him, soft, almost unsure. He nodded. "From stump to shingle." Her gaze lingered on the beams above. Strong hands. Elias managed the faintest smile. "Used to be steadier. These days they ache more than they craft." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she looked into the flames, as if the fire held answers she had once known but forgotten. After a long moment, she asked, "You live here always?" "First winter," Elias replied. "Came for quiet. Thought it'd be simpler than what I left behind." Her eyes moved to the scar along his right temple, half covered by hair. "War?" He nodded, "and things after." She didn't press further. Neither did he. In a place like this, you didn't need to ask for stories. They were stitched into every silence. Nakoma finished her food and placed the bowl gently on the floor beside her. Then she folded her legs beneath her and pulled the blanket tighter. Her shoulders dropped ever so slightly, a subtle sign that the cold inside her was finally relenting. Elias stood. "I'll set up a place for you to sleep. Cot's yours." She hesitated, then nodded. As he unrolled the mattress in the far corner and laid out another blanket, he caught her watching him. Not with fear now, but with something quieter. Something almost like gratitude. Later, as he lay near the door, the rifle within arm's reach but untouched, he stared into the rafters and listened. Not to the wind this time. To the rhythm of another person breathing, a sound he hadn't heard in a long, long time. The wind that night wasn't just wind. It groaned through the trees like something ancient and wounded, and when it hit the cabin walls, the whole structure seemed to sigh. Elias had checked the beams twice before settling down, listening for any telltale creaks that might signal a flaw in his work. But the logs held, solid, true. Still, sleep came slowly. He lay on the floor near the door, wrapped in a spare wool coat, boots still on. Nakoma slept across the room on the cot, the blanket tucked under her chin, her breath shallow but steady. Her face, by firelight, looked younger than 19, almost childlike, except for the set of her jaw, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes. She'd seen things, survived them. Outside, the storm slammed into the valley with full force. Snow piled against the shutters. The wind howled like something denied entry. Elias turned his head toward the ceiling. His eyes landed on the beam above the hearth, one he had carved a message into with a penknife the day the cabin was framed. "Mercy dwells here," it read. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was Anna's phrase, something she used to say when they took in wounded men during the war. Blue coat or gray, it didn't matter. If they bled, they stayed. Mercy dwells here. Back then, he'd believed her. Back then, she'd still believed it herself. But Kansas City had made mercy feel like foolishness. He had built homes for other people's dreams, watched them sell those dreams for silver, then cast him out like an empty bottle. When Anna died coughing blood into her hands, there'd been no mercy left, just paperwork and quiet and cold. And yet tonight, he had opened the door to someone with no name, offered food, warmth, his wife's blanket. Mercy again. He sat up slowly, bones complaining. The fire needed feeding. As he tossed on another log, he saw Nokoma stir. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then locked on him. "Storm still bad?" she asked, voice groggy. He nodded. "Worse I've seen in years." She sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "No one should be outside in this." "No one but you," he replied, instantly regretting the sharpness of it. She didn't flinch. "I was going north, didn't expect the storm." "You're alone?" A pause. "Yes." The word landed heavier than it should have. Elias didn't ask why. He didn't ask what waited for her up north, or what she was leaving behind. He knew better than most. Sometimes stories stayed buried because digging them up cost more than letting them lie. "I can get more water," she offered, rising to her feet. He motioned her down. "You need rest." "I'm not weak," she said. "I didn't say you were." Their eyes met across the firelight. A beat passed, quiet but not empty. Then she lay back down, slowly, carefully. He watched her for a moment longer before returning to his makeshift bedding. Snow hissed against the windows, wind clawed at the eaves. But inside, the walls held. And somewhere deep in Elias Mercer's chest, beneath the guilt, the years, the silence, something else held too. The storm broke in the gray light before dawn. Not with a sudden calm, but with the weary silence of something spent. The world outside lay hushed and blanketed, as if even the trees were exhaling. Elias woke to the quiet. For a long moment he lay still, listening, not for danger this time, but for the simple presence of another breath across the room. It was there. Nokoma hadn't vanished. By the time the fire was stirred and a pot of coffee boiled over the hearth, Nokoma sat upright on the cot, her eyes tracing the window as if gauging the weather with instinct more than sight. "Clear?" she asked. He poured coffee into a tin mug and handed it to her. "Looks that way." She took it without ceremony, cradling it in both hands. Her palms were red with cold, healing but not healed. The steam curled into her hair like a benediction. "We'll need more wood," Elias said, mostly to himself. "I'll help." He raised an eyebrow. "You don't need to." "I want to." They stepped out together into the crisp morning. The snow was knee-deep in places, but soft. The trees dripped slowly, the world beginning to thaw beneath a pale sun. The quiet was immense. Elias handed her a smaller hatchet. She took it confidently, adjusting her grip like someone who knew the weight of tools. They worked in rhythm, not talking, not needing to. She followed his lead, hauling short logs to the chopping block, steadying them as he swung. Once, when the blade glanced wrong and sparked against a knot, she didn't flinch, just waited. As they worked, Elias noticed the way she moved. Sure-footed, alert, like the forest spoke to her in ways he hadn't learned. When the stack grew chest-high, he paused to catch his breath. Nokoma, standing beside him, pointed toward the edge of the clearing where the snow thinned over a line of dark stone. "Old River," she said, almost dreamily, "ran deep through here." He followed her finger. The earth there looked different, somehow, eroded in a pattern that hadn't matched the rest of the hill. "Long ago," she added, "good land." Elias nodded. For crops? She didn't answer immediately. Everything starts where water ran. Life and other things. There was something in her tone, not warning, not promise, just knowing. He filed it away. A casual comment, maybe, or maybe something more. Out here, meaning came slow. They hauled the last load in just as the sky began to gray again. Inside, the fire welcomed them like an old friend. Elias handed her another mug of coffee. Nokoma sat near the fire, silent, her eyes still turned toward the window, toward that patch of earth where snow covered something forgotten. He didn't press. He'd learned long ago. People gave what they meant to when they were ready. Still, the phrase lingered in his mind. Good land. It sounded like more than farming. By the second morning, the sky had returned to its usual shade of steel, the kind that never quite promised sun. Elias woke to cold stone beneath his shoulder and the smell of smoke clinging to the wool blanket. The fire had gone out sometime during the night, but the cabin still held a soft residual warmth, not from heat, but from something harder to name. He sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, and looked toward the cot. Empty.
The blanket was folded neatly at the foot, every corner aligned as though measured. The pillow had been fluffed and smoothed. The bowl she'd used the night before sat on the table, cleaned and dried. No sound of boots on snow. No draft from the door. She was gone. Elias crossed the room, opened the latch, and stepped outside barefoot, his feet sinking into the snow. He scanned the clearing. The snow was fresh in places, drifted up along the barn wall, untouched by birds or wind. But at the northern edge, the line of footprints told the truth. Narrow, light, steady. Nokoma's. He followed them with his eyes as far as he could, but they vanished into the tree line. No note, no farewell, just her silence, once again. He didn't know why it unsettled him more than if she'd stayed. Inside, he built the fire again from the embers. His hands worked automatically, stack, flint, breath. But his mind turned in circles. Had she meant to go? Was it planned from the start? He had seen no pack, no supplies. But she had survived before. She would again. He made coffee, ate alone. The silence felt heavier now. Not the clean kind he'd come here to find, but something emptier.
The cabin was warm, but lacked presence. He looked at the folded blanket, still faintly carrying her scent. Wood smoke, leather, the bite of cold. He didn't move it, just left it where she had placed it, as if disturbing it would break whatever understanding had passed silently between them. No tears, no speeches. She had simply returned to where she came from, or perhaps kept moving toward whatever waited beyond the timber. But something about her absence clung to him. That afternoon, Elias took his axe and headed out to the far edge of the property, needing the rhythm of labor to still his thoughts. He split logs until his shoulders burned, stacking them in clean rows. The same spot where Nokoma had pointed 2 days earlier caught his eye again, the smooth run of earth now half covered in powder. He found himself walking toward it, though he couldn't have said why. The wind picked up as he reached the edge. His boot caught on a root beneath the snow, and he stumbled. As he reached out to catch himself, his glove hit something hard, not rock, not root. He knelt and brushed the snow away. It revealed a dark patch of earth, different from the rest, softer, stained. Or still did. He stayed there for a moment, crouched, listening to nothing. Then he stood, slowly. Nokoma was gone, but she had left something behind, and Elias wasn't entirely sure it had been an accident. It was late morning 2 days after Nokoma's departure when Elias's axe struck something that didn't belong. He had taken to splitting logs again behind the cabin, the only thing that seemed to quiet his thoughts. The snow had begun to crust,
hardening overnight into a shell that cracked underfoot. His breath hung heavy, curling over the chopping block as he raised the axe for another swing. The blade came down, but instead of the dull thud of pine giving way, the steel rang with a sharp, metallic pitch. Not like rock, not root. He froze. Setting the axe aside, Elias crouched and cleared the split log and snow away. Beneath, packed into the frozen earth, was something darker than dirt. A glint, faint at first, then unmistakable. He brushed at it with his glove, then scraped gently with the back of his axe head. A jagged line of yellow threaded through the stone like lightning through ash. The color was too rich, too pure to be mistaken for anything else. Gold. For a moment, Elias didn't move. He just stared, breath fogging the air. Then he stood slowly, his hands shaking. From cold, from something older than excitement. Gold. In his land. The rational part of him, the builder, the planner, pushed forward first. It could be a small deposit, surface trace, fool's hope. But even as the thoughts came, his eyes were already scanning the ground beyond, tracing the line where the snow met stone. Nokoma's words returned to him. Old river, good land. He hadn't understood her tone then. Now it rang in his ears with the weight of something prophetic. He knelt again and ran his hand over the fractured vein. It wasn't deep, but it wasn't shallow either. If there was more beneath, if this line continued. The implications began to uncoil inside him like a snake awakened. Gold meant value, and value meant attention. People, claim jumpers, investors, greed. Greed that never came alone. It came with weapons, with lawmen, with men who bent law for their benefit. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. He hadn't come here for this. He'd come to disappear, to build something no one could take from him. A roof, a hearth, a quiet life. A place where silence healed instead of haunted. But now, under the earth he'd thought he knew, something else stirred. Something that would not stay buried. He rose and returned to the cabin without a word. Inside, he knelt by the hearth, poured water into a basin, and washed the dirt from his hands. The gold flecks clung to his skin like guilt. Above the mantel, Anna's pouch hung still. He looked at it. Then to the blanket, still folded at the foot of the cot. She had said little, just enough. He wondered if she'd known all along, or if her words, spoken in passing, had been more than they seemed. As the wind picked up again outside, Elias poured himself coffee with unsteady hands. He sat at the table, staring into the mug, not drinking. The world had shifted, quietly, permanently. He whispered a verse, not aloud, but in memory, one his wife used to speak when hope seemed like something too distant to reach. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. Psalm 126:5. He looked down at his hands again, calloused, weathered, strong. They had sown sorrow for many years. And now something had begun to grow. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, staring down at the dark seam that twisted through the frost-bitten soil like an old scar. The gold was still there, visible in streaks no wider than a finger. He'd uncovered more of it that morning, cautiously, carefully, not with pick or spade, but with the reverence of a man afraid to wake something bigger than himself. He'd mapped the vein in his notebook, a diagonal path running northeast, tracking eerily close to the dry channel Nokoma had pointed to. The more he uncovered, the more it matched her simple, cryptic words. Old river, good land. He didn't believe in omens, not before, but now He wasn't so sure. The vein was no accident. It had waited under his feet, untouched for who knows how long, and it revealed itself only after he'd shared fire, food, and his wife's blanket with a stranger. That alone made the discovery feel less like luck and more like consequence. Back inside the cabin, Elias spread his findings on the table. Sketches, dirt-stained rock samples, gold dust in a rag-lined jar. It wasn't just a pocket. The gold ran deep, consistent, substantial. Enough to draw men from towns he'd never set foot in. Enough to shatter the peace he'd come to this place to find. He stared at the jar, then pushed it away, as if distance might dull its power. What now? He could keep it quiet, dig only what he needed. But that would be temporary. The earth couldn't keep secrets forever. Someone else might stumble onto it, or worse, suspect and come looking with the wrong intentions. He could sell, walk away, let someone else take the burden and the wealth. But what would that make him? A man who built his solitude only to abandon it when it became inconvenient? Or he could stay, build something from it, not for gold's sake, but because of the chance it represented. Not for himself, but for others. He thought again of Nokoma, her quiet watchfulness, her understanding without demand. She hadn't taken anything, hadn't asked for anything, and yet somehow she'd given him more than anyone since Anna. He picked up the blue blanket from the cot and folded it slowly. He held it for a long time before placing it gently in the trunk, along with the jar of gold dust. That night, Elias sat by the fire, notebook open in his lap. He began to draw, not just maps of the vein, but something larger, a plan, a camp, a ledger of names, a list of supplies, lines connecting cabins, a smithy, a clinic. He wasn't building a fortune, he was building a town. The wind rose again outside, less bitter now. The trees shifted like they were listening. He added the final mark on the map, a small square at the center set near the first clearing, labeled simply Mercer Creek, founded spring 1883. A home not for one man, but for many. As the fire settled into its embers, Elias leaned back in his chair. His body ached, but something else stirred within him. Not ambition, not greed, responsibility. He glanced once more at the folded blanket. Even in her absence, Nokoma had changed the course of his life. Not with promises or gold, but with a gesture, an act of trust that had reminded him who he was supposed to be. He had come to this land to disappear. Now he understood. He was meant to build something that could last. If you found yourself drawn into this story, a like and a comment would mean a lot. By the spring of 1888, Mercer Creek was more than a miner's outpost. It had grown into a town with breath in its lungs, a church bell that rang true, children racing through muddy lanes, and a general store with shelves that no longer sat empty. Folks came from all directions, drawn by gold, yes, but many stayed for something harder to name, a feeling. At the heart of it all stood Elias Mercer. Not in office, he never ran for anything, but in presence. People turned to him like trees turn to sun. He answered quietly, worked honestly, and listened without rush. When disputes arose, it was his cabin porch they gathered on. He was the kind of man folks followed without being told. Yet in all things, he remained simple. He still lived in the same one-room cabin by the woods, though a second bunk had been built, and a small lean-to added for tools. He wore the same patched coat, rode the same mule, and kept to the same quiet rhythms. And at the foot of his bed, always, every night, lay a folded blue blanket, worn thin with age. Some thought it was his late wife's, but a few, those who'd heard fragments of the story, knew it had belonged to someone else. A girl no one had seen in years. A girl who once came knocking in the dead of winter. He never spoke her name. But some nights folks said they saw him walk out toward the old tree line, stand there a while, then come back in silence, like a man meeting a memory too sacred for words. Elias never took credit for the town's success. When people thanked him, he only nodded. But in the ledger at the post office, the one where early founders signed their names, next to his, he'd scrawled a single word in neat, angular script: remember. The gold had built the roads, yes, but it was the night of the storm, the act of kindness no one saw, that built the foundation. And so Mercer Creek stood, not just on precious metal, but on something rarer still: mercy. It was late October when they found it, the bundle. A pair of miners working just beyond the North Ridge, digging the foundation for a new storage shed, struck a patch of earth that crumbled too quickly. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth darkened by years, was something strange, not metal, not bone. One of the men called for Elias. When he arrived, the parcel was already open. Inside, a small carved horse, no bigger than a man's palm, its legs tucked, tail curved, worn smooth from handling. A corner of familiar blue wool, and between them a folded scrap of thick paper, sealed with a strip of tree resin hardened like glass. Elias didn't speak. He lifted the horse first, turning it in his calloused fingers. His breath caught, not from the cold. He knew the workmanship. He had seen it once in Nokoma's hands, briefly, in the flicker of firelight. She had clutched it while warming herself near the hearth. A keepsake, a memory. He unwrapped the blanket next, a fragment only, cut clean, no fray. She had taken a piece with her. And then the note. It was written in blocky, unsure letters. The ink had bled, but not enough to blur the words. The script was mixed, English and Arapaho, but he could read it. I saw what slept under your land. My grandfather taught me the river's shape. I did not speak it. I wanted to see what kindness did when gold was not asked for. No name, no date, just that. A confession, or perhaps a blessing. The miners looked confused. Elias said nothing. He folded the paper with slow precision, wrapped the blanket fragment back around it, and held the horse to his chest for a long moment. Then he turned and walked home. That evening, he placed the bundle in a cedar box he kept near the hearth, where the wedding Bible lay, where Anna's comb rested, never used, where the most fragile things lived, in silence. Later, when the townsfolk asked what had been found, Elias only said, "A truth I wasn't ready for, but was always owed." They didn't ask more. They saw it in his face. Something had shifted. That night he sat by the fire and traced his finger along the grain of the horse's flank. In the flicker of flame, it almost looked like it moved. Nokoma had known, and still she had waited. Elias read the note again under lamplight, slower this time, letting the weight of each word settle into the grain of his table. I saw what slept under your land. My grandfather taught me the river's shape. I did not speak it. I wanted to see what kindness did when gold was not asked for. He could hear her voice, though he had only known it in fragments, broken English, soft syllables, long silences. But now, through this letter, he heard something else entirely: certainty, wisdom, and grace. She had known, from the beginning. The moment she'd stepped into his cabin, frostbitten and silent, she'd already read the land the way others read the sky. Her grandfather, an elder who could see the buried rivers beneath dry earth, had taught her well. She had known there was gold, and she said nothing, not to test him, not to punish him, but to witness him. Elias set the paper down, his hands trembling. All these years he had carried the story, a stranger in need, a man who gave what little he had and was somehow rewarded. A moral tale people liked to whisper. But now it was different. Now he realized the blanket had not been a gift, but a mirror. And in that mirror she had watched what he would do. Not when eyes were on him, but when there was no promise of return. He stood and paced slowly, his boots creaking the floorboards. What was kindness when no reward was waiting? What was a man's heart when gold slept quietly beneath his cabin? And what did it mean that she had seen his life, his grief, his silence, and chosen not to interfere, only to bear witness? Elias knelt at the hearth, where the fire was low but steady. He whispered a verse into the crackle, the one that had returned to him many times, but now carried a new weight. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. Luke 16:10. For the first time he understood its full breadth. He had not passed a test, he had lived a truth. And someone like Nakoma, had honored that truth, even in silence. That night, Elias took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a single sentence. To the one who watched and said nothing and gave everything. He folded it carefully, placed it next to the bundle in the cedar box, and sat still for a long time. Something in him had come full circle. Not because he'd won, but because he'd been seen and still chosen. The next morning, Elias stood outside his cabin before the sun had cleared the pines. The air held that stillness only found at the edge of winter, where frost sparkled on every branch, and the sky, though pale, promised clarity. He carried no tools, just the small cedar box in his hands. By midday, he was at the center of town, where two roads crossed near the new schoolhouse. Children's voices echoed from inside, learning letters, reciting scriptures. Life, in its most tender form. Elias entered the town hall, a modest structure he'd helped raise with his own hands. Inside, the ledger that held every decision, donation, and name rested beneath glass. He removed the cover and began writing. Not a will, not a journal, but a charter. He called it the Mercer Foundation. Its purpose: to dedicate 1/4 of all mining profits to the betterment of indigenous families displaced across the region, specifically the Arapaho. He outlined funds for a medical clinic with traditional healing options, a bilingual school, grants for apprenticeships in carpentry, metallurgy, and reading. He did not list himself as founder. He listed Nakoma, just her first name. No surname, no title, but beside it a phrase written in his own script: "For the one who knew the river and chose mercy." When the elders and businessmen read the proposal days later, silence followed. Then questions. Then a few objections. But Elias only listened, then spoke once. "You call me wise for not selling to the highest bidder," he said, eyes steady. "But the wisdom wasn't mine. It came on a winter wind, wrapped in silence, and left me with a choice." He paused. "Now I choose again." The vote passed. That spring, signs were posted around town. Mercer Foundation Clinic, opening July. All are welcome. A path was cleared from the forest edge to town, labeled Nakoma's Walk. It passed by the old cabin, which he turned into a public shelter for any traveler with nowhere to go. Each evening, Elias sat outside with his coffee and watched the lamps flicker on across Mercer Creek. Not from pride, but gratitude. He thought often of her, of the way she'd stepped out of the blizzard and into his life like a verse waiting for voice, of the strength it took to stay silent, and the trust it took to leave. What she had given him was not gold, it was permission to become something more than what the world had allowed him to be. It began with whispers, soft as snowmelt, quick as smoke through pines. A child, lost during a spring thaw, returned to her family with cheeks red and dry clothes tightly around her. She said a forest lady with dark hair and quiet eyes had walked her through a frozen gulch and pointed the way. A hunter, thrown from his horse and pinned by a fallen branch, told of a woman who wrapped his leg with herbs and bound it with sinew. When he blinked, she was gone, but his pain had eased, and he had crawled home with his rifle in hand. Then came the old widow, who swore someone had lit a lantern at her door during a blizzard. The flames stayed burning until morning, though she had no oil in the house. At first, people called them stories, fancy, folklore spun by weather-worn minds. But Elias listened, not with doubt nor with haste. He simply folded his hands and heard what each person said, their tone, their eyes, the way they searched for words they didn't have. They all spoke of the same woman, tall, with braids like river paths, and a presence that made no sound. She never gave a name. She never asked for thanks. The children started calling her the Watcher, others Forest Sister, and once, in a letter from a traveling preacher passing through, she was described as a spirit of mercy wrapped in buckskin and silence, neither ghost nor woman, but a witness. Elias knew better. One night, he climbed the ridge beyond the north pasture, the one that overlooked the Medicine Bow Range. It was quiet up there. Wind moved low through the grass. The stars burned like truths. He sat on a cold stone and remembered the knock, that first knock, all those years ago. He remembered how close he'd come to turning her away, and how different this place would be had he done so. He reached into his coat and removed a slip of parchment, now creased and softened with time. Nakoma's note. He read it aloud to no one, then folded it once more and whispered, "I know you're still watching, and so am I." He stood, looked out over Mercer Creek, now lit with lanterns, filled with song. The town had grown, but the woods still held their silence, and somewhere in them, Elias believed, Mercy still walked. The sky over Mercer Creek was gunmetal gray on the anniversary of the storm. 12 winters had passed since Elias first opened his door to Nakoma. The town had long since outgrown its beginnings. The foundation flourished, the clinic was full, and children read both English and Arapaho side by side in sunlit rooms. But that day Elias walked alone, toward the old cabin, now more shrine than shelter. He hadn't visited it in some time. The wood creaked under his step, softened by snow and memory. Inside, everything remained as it had been. The hearthstone blackened but clean, the rocking chair in its quiet arc, the table where she had once sipped broth without a word. The blanket was gone. He noticed it immediately, not missing, but returned. It was folded precisely, just as he had folded it for her that first night. Only now the frayed edge had been mended, re-stitched with thin sinew in a pattern of mountain and river. Elias did not speak. He turned, and she was there. Nakoma stood in the doorway, hood down, hair streaked with silver, eyes unchanged. She wore a coat the color of pine bark, and around her neck a single bead, blue, oval, like a river stone smoothed by time. Neither moved. Then, quietly, she stepped in. They sat. For a long while, nothing was said. The fire lit itself in Elias's mind, not with flame, but memory. He saw the wind howling outside, her shivering form, the blanket in his hands, the knock. Finally, he asked, "Why now?" She looked at him, then the folded cloth, and answered simply, "Because now you see." Elias nodded. "I didn't know it was a choice," he said. "You did," she replied. "You just didn't name it."
They shared bread and hot tea in the same tin cups. Nokoma spoke little, but when she did, her voice carried the weight of rivers. She told of places she'd gone, people she'd helped, wrongs quietly made right. When she stood to leave, Elias reached for the blanket. But she stopped him. "No," she said gently, "it's yours now." He took it, not as a gift, but as a covenant. As she stepped into the doorway, the wind picked up, scattering snow like feathers. She turned once more. Elias said softly, "He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much." Luke 16:10. She smiled and was gone, not vanishing, just walking back into the land, like a story closing its final page. If you like this video, please comment number 1. If you don't like it, please comment number 2. The stars were sharper than usual, not just brighter, but closer, as if the heavens themselves had leaned down to listen.
Elias and Nokoma sat on the cabin's front step, the same worn plank that had held boots, snow, and memory for years. The wind was gentle. The creek below hummed like a hymn. Between them lay the old blanket, mended and strong again, stretched across their knees. A fire crackled quietly behind them, but it was the warmth of shared silence that truly held the night. Nokoma's eyes traced the outlines of the town below, Mercer Creek, glowing in amber lanterns and starlight. Chimneys puffed smoke in steady rhythm. Children's laughter still lingered from supper hours past. From up here, it all seemed impossibly small and impossibly full of grace. "You watched all this?" Elias asked softly, not accusing, only wondering. "I watched you," she replied. Her voice was low, nearly a whisper. "The gold, it brings much, but not always good. My grandfather said, 'What lies beneath only wakes what's already inside a man.' I needed to see if what was inside you would hold." Elias said nothing at first. The words hung in the air like steam from a kettle. "I didn't hold anything," he said finally. "I stumbled forward, hoped not to fall."
"You gave me more credit than I earned." She turned to him then. "No, I gave you a chance." They sat in stillness a while longer. She nodded toward the town. "They build, they teach, they share. That's your doing." He shook his head. "No, that was the moment you didn't speak. That silence, that was the first stone in every building down there." A smile touched the corner of her mouth. From beneath her coat she pulled a pouch, simple leather, tied with sinew. She placed it gently on the blanket between them. Elias opened it and found inside a single river stone, polished and veined with gold. "From the old river," she said. "A reminder, not of wealth, but of what sleeps quietly under the surface." They looked out again, over a town built not on greed, but on giving. "I'll leave soon," Nokoma said, almost like the breeze itself had spoken. Elias's hand rested lightly on the blanket. "I know. You've made it enough," she said. "Mercy doesn't always stay. Sometimes it only visits, long enough to plant something." He exhaled, eyes closed. They sat until the stars moved slightly. Then, with only a nod, Nokoma stood. But this time she didn't disappear into the woods.
She lingered. He stood with her. They embraced, not tightly, but with the reverence of those who had never expected to meet again. Before she turned, he said quietly, "You were my turning." She paused, then added her own, "And you were my hope." They looked once more at the town, a place of children, books, and softened hearts. Then Nokoma walked down the hill, toward the tree line, her figure framed by moonlight. Not vanishing, just returning to where mercy waits. Elias stayed until dawn, the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The years slipped past like dusk through pine needles, not in haste, but with the gentle certainty of things that know their place. Elias Mercer never left Mercer Creek. He remained its quiet pillar, even as his steps slowed and his hair turned white like the first frost. He continued to visit the foundation schoolhouse each Thursday, walking the hallways while children read aloud from scripture and poetry, their voices echoing like revival hymns through wooden beams. He didn't carry ledgers anymore. Others managed the books now, but he did carry stories. He passed them along like heirlooms, tales of storms weathered, meals shared, and the blanket that once saved a life and changed a town. He never told them who Nokoma really was. He didn't need to. Some knew her only from whispers. Some from the touch of a healing hand during a fevered night. Others from a fire lit during the worst blizzard Mercer Creek ever saw. But none questioned her presence, only what they would do if she was watching. The Mercer Foundation thrived. By its 20th year, it had funded 3 schools across the Northern Territories, employed dozens of Arapaho herbalists and healers, and created land trust agreements to protect sacred grounds. A community garden behind the clinic bore a wooden sign carved with Nokoma's name and the Arapaho word for listen. Elias's home, now moved closer to the town's heart, remained simple. The blanket still lay folded at the end of his bed each morning. He rarely used it, not out of reverence, but because its weight carried memory more than warmth. On his final spring, knowing his time neared, he walked once more to the cabin, alone. The trail was longer now, or perhaps his legs were simply older.
But he made the journey without hurry, pausing every so often to listen, not for sound, but for presence. At the cabin's door, he placed the blanket gently on the table. Then he retrieved a small brass seal, the emblem of the Mercer Foundation, a tree rooted over a river. He pressed it into soft wax atop a new ledger, freshly bound. Then, beneath the Foundation's mission, he added a single line in his own aging script. "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works." Ephesians 2:10. He closed the book and smiled. Not for what had been built, though it was good. Not for the gold that had once slept beneath him, but for the silence that had asked him to choose. And for the hand that once knocked, not demanding help, but offering purpose. Long after Elias passed, the cabin became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Travelers came not for treasure, but for stillness. Inside they found the blanket, clean, folded, resting on a wooden bench beside the Foundation's seal. Above it hung a carving, a single line burned into oak. "Kindness, when unseen, builds what gold never can." And through the open window, the wind still whispered.
Some said they saw her, a tall figure at the edge of the trees, braid trailing behind like the tail of a comet. But whether spirit or woman, none could say. Only that mercy had walked here once, and left light in its steps. Continue the journey with true Wild West stories, where every tale stirs the embers of memory. Every character echoes the silence of time. Follow us for stories that reach beyond history, touching the quiet corners of the heart with nostalgia, grace, and the enduring spirit of the West.